Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single story at a time. I'm Ingrid Wenzler, here with al-Sirgany and Matthew Schmidt.
Hello.
As well as the dog, cat, and bird, who I guess will do their best to make some noise themselves. Today we'll be discussing Children Are Civilians Too, the title story of Heinrich Böll's 1970 collection as translated by Lila Venevitz. The story begins with a squabble. The unnamed protagonist wants to be allowed outside. He'd like to go buy cakes from a pretty little Russian girl. The sentry insists that the distinctions the soldier tries making, that he's not a patient, but one of the wounded, and the workarounds the soldier comes up with, what if the little girl just came inside, make no difference. Rules are rules. Children are civilians too. The story is simple, in a way that certain reviewers and publishers seem to want to apologize for. Personally, I don't see any reason for that, but before we get into the virtues and vices of simplicity in this story and others, I thought maybe we could talk about the story's opening. As I've noted, this story begins with a squabble, and because we aren't given backstory or any context for the squabble, we can say this story begins in medias res, a Latin phrase that translates literally to in the middle of things. How does beginning in the middle of things like that shape the story that follows, its pacing, your sense of character, of setting, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? I think that the fact that the story opens up where it does means that what we're never going to learn, Matthew and I were kind of chatting before we got started today just about whether or not you can identify where this soldier is from, which, as he also wisely noted, is complicated by some of the choices in the translation that might cue up British English, which could mean that the soldier is British, or it could just be the choice in translation. I think that you don't have context for who the soldier is in that way, and you're looking for those cues throughout the text, and the import of sneaking through a hole beside a urinal and the level of realism about that, and why that feels important to the soldier, and what we can and can't know about the soldier are a little up for grabs as a result. And I think there's also, I kind of hate to use this word about it, right? But there is a dreamlike quality to it that the context for why we're doing what we're doing or how we get there sort of opens up, and in some ways doesn't have. I'm eager to talk about the virtues and vices of that, but it doesn't have some of the scene setting pieces that a longer story would include, even if it began sort of somewhere in the middle of a life or a set of events.
I think dreamlike is a good word for describing the story, because of the way we enter into it and because of the way it insists on certain particulars and not others. So,
oh, sure.
I think it's a good one to choose in this particular case.
Yeah, I think beginning like this with dialogue, actually, it doesn't ground the story, and so there's a constant uncertainty, throughout this exchange with the sentry and the narrator, and then again with the narrator and the little Russian girl. You keep asking questions about, as Adam has pointed out, who the narrator is, where the narrator's from, how certain things happen, and I think it also it begins in the middle in some respects because it's after World War II, and thus like the effects of World War II maybe will never go away. But this is like in the years following it. Presumably, this is still either a prisoner of war or an injured soldier if we were to read it just on the surface level. However, the story pokes holes in its own logic there. And I think, in some respects, that's the dreamlike quality that we're getting at, is that we're not given a ton of details, outside of dialogue, and really kind of two characters, maybe 3 possibly, and so it really lends itself to the idea of what are we to do now that the war has ended, and the world is trying to get back to some sense of what it was before, which it really never can, but there are still people displaced, and like, what do those displaced people do? Where do they belong?
Yeah, exactly. I think the story does raise questions along those lines. And I think something that's really striking to me about the opening is, you don't get in fiction very often stories that begin with dialogue in this way. And, I think it at once doesn't ground the story, but it also, in breaking this usual rule, I don't think it's metafictional at all, even though it is talking about rules and things. I do find it immediately engaging. I understand what the general conflict is, and that kind of hooks me. And I find that, in sort of pointing me to a specific conflict, I end up entering into the story very fast, as opposed to wondering too much about the usual things you'd get, the who, what, where.
Yeah, I actually, in that way, right, I have thought a lot about, to Matthew's point, is this immediately after the war? Is it somehow, it's during the war, but in a POW camp in a very particular way? Why, how deep into Russia can we possibly be? But I think also, there's something about the way that this story works, in its sense of time that alludes to, what the hell's the name of the first story in our time? Is it On the Key, where there's the kind of
it is. I'm not sure if it's the first, but I would guess that's the one.
Yeah.
That is a title.
Yeah, where they're moving all the people out of a village because of right. There's something, as I remember it, that one starts. It's definitely in the middle of the action, if not also with dialogue. It's been a long time now since I've read that book. But there's something about that, that displacement and the kind of cross-cultural communication and the semi-humanitarian impulse of the bureaucratic actions, and the kind of need of, in this case, the soldier who's keeping the patient inside to deal with this situation in this way at all, or have this conversation, right? There's something sort of ultimately powerful about just ignoring other people's content, but there's a different kind of power game to I'm going to listen to your request, I'm going to ignore it entirely. Or I'm going to argue with you about why you're wrong to reassert what my power is and how it operates on you. And there's something tense there that we're immediately into. It's not just dialogue someone shouting at someone else, or someone going, oh my God, and then you're in the middle of some kind of chaos. Rather, there are stakes immediately, and those stakes aren't necessarily what's being discussed on the surface of the conversation.
That's so well put. It actually sort of debunks a small theory that I've had. I keep thinking about the fact that, there are stakes immediately, but, one of the first things I was taught, kind of one of the only rules I was given in an introduction to fiction class was like, don't begin a story with dialogue this way, and don't begin with an emergency. The example was like, don't begin with a character on an ambulance without naming the character first.
Yeah.
And I think, On the Key is a perfect example of a story, whether it begins in dialogue or not, with a story that begins with very high stakes, where you're sort of thrust into the middle of it. So,
Yeah, sidebar. That's an asinine rule that I have a particular thing against, because I think it's the kind of rule that people assert to 18-year-olds, because many 18-year-olds will do it really, really poorly.
Right.
And then they scar them for life by insinuating that there's something in fiction that they couldn't do really, really well if they just learned the skill sets. Seems like a really damaging way to use your time and educational power. But that's...
Sure, and in all fairness, I don't know that it was
I got
rule
that,
asserted with an
taught that
iron
rule by at
fist
least 4
in
teachers.
my case. But anyway, I think this helps me transition to my next question, which I think is related to this first one. So I think of Böll as having a special gift for what I want to call chattiness. To me, it's not just that he has a good ear and gets dialogue right. It's that, but I also think it's more than that. As a reader, I often feel like I'm right there with his characters, trading casual, sometimes intimate impressions. What do you think of the treatment of voice, dialogue, and interior monologue in this story?
Well, I think that's an interesting question based on a little experiment we did earlier with the dialogue. We happen to have 2 copies of Children Are Civilians 2, the original 1970 version, and then a slight revision from, I believe, 95 or so.
95.
Same translator, and really only one major word has been changed, and that is that at one point the narrator says, "You're a bloody fool," and the sentry says back, quote, "Anyone who still has a sense of duty is considered a bloody fool by you fellows." And the bloody has been changed to damn. You're a damn fool, And I think that was interesting, because one of the reasons we even got to this place was we were thinking over where the prisoner was from.
Mm-hmm.
And since Heinrich Böll is German, and it would make sense the Germans were in Russia,
Yeah.
it would make sense that the prisoner, patient, whatever you want to call him, is German. But we kind of we're tentative, because bloody fool is a very English usage of that term. But I guess to go back to the question a little bit more cogently, is it does feel like a playful conversation in its own way.
Oh, yeah.
In spite of the fact that the narrator is arguing with the sentry. And, the dialogue is to the point where it's like the narrator says, "Have a heart."
Right.
He just wants to eat these cakes from this little girl. And we even go so far as to have the little Russian girl wink at our narrator.
Yeah.
And show him to this inexplicable hole next to a urinal, an outside urinal.
I have a lot of questions.
An outside urinal in this whatever type of prison / hospital this is. And so it's a very I think that kind of wistfulness at the beginning with the dialogue and so forth, like sets us up for this, possible deus ex machina to make the story operate, because he's not allowed to get the cakes without this hole in the wall next to the urinal. And that is like the centerpiece of the middle of this short story, and leads him on to say some things about himself, the narrator that is, later. And so, that particular combination of starting in the middle of things and then, being a bit playful, even though the sentry is actually upset, and trying to follow, as we are told, rules. The rules are the rules, right? And that's kind of where the title comes from, right? Like, our narrator says, why not let the little girl inside? I just want to buy the cakes. If you're not going to let me out, let her in. And he says, the sentry says, civilians are not allowed inside. Our narrator says, but it's just a child. The child's just a child. And the sentry responds, I suppose children aren't civilians, eh? Right?
Yeah, I think that there's a ton of stuff there. We're later going to get like this question about who, not only where someone's from, but who they are keeps coming up, right? Like later on, there's a 3-page story or 4-page story, depending on the copy, by the way. Like, so later on is a relative thing, but like, right, like, quote, damn it all, I thought. Am I really a patient? End quote. And then I noticed a hole in the wall next to the urinal. On the other side of the hole stood the little girl with the cakes. The sentry couldn't see us here. May the Fuhrer bless your sense of duty, I thought. Which, that particular paragraph really strikes me as important and strange, not only because we come back to this question of like whether or not children are civilians, whether or not I really am a patient, meaning perhaps I'm a prisoner more than I am a patient, or I'm wounded over being a patient, and the distinction there, but also, right, it opens up a certain kind of question. We do know that the sentry is German because of the reference to may the Fuhrer bless your sense of duty. But I think there's also a possibility opened up there that perhaps this person is, some kind of equivalent to a conscientious objector or someone who's gone AWOL, and so they may in fact be German. I mean, to the thing we discussed, the word changing bloody to damn, right? Like, I've been sitting here this morning wondering, is that a politically correct move to get rid of the sort of menstrual reference that comes with bloody, or is it to uninsinuate the idea of Britishness in this person, or is it to create, did Boole actually use the word damn in 3 places, and originally the translator was trying to get the damn out a little bit so that the damn it all would stand out differently. And I mean, unfortunately, Matthew's got a little German, the rest of us don't. We don't have the original copy, so maybe someone listening to this will call us up and tell us someday. But I think that all of that sense of identity and that sense of displacement in any of those situations becomes so live, but there are these human needs that end up getting expressed anyway. And I think a lot of what this story does deal with this sense of conversation in the way that we try and hold on to things. I've been working my way through Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House, and she spends quite a lot of time actually on a section that just recounts an episode of Star Trek where someone's being tortured and is constantly asked how many lights there are, and he sort of refuses to answer incorrectly. And there's something about this, like, refusal to accept the oppressor's sense of language, or who you feel oppressed by sense of language, that feels really important. One thing when you'd sort of present like drafts of your questions that I was thinking about, Ingrid, is that right, because we don't know where the quote unquote patient or prisoner or wounded individual is from, like there's a sense of how you would communicate that might have a certain amount of breakage in it. I think because I can only read Böll in translation, I have this weird kind of relationship to the kind of idiomatic language that we get. I mean, the translator has taken the time to translate in the sort of like Russian fidi as opposed to 50 into the text. So I think there is something like verisimilitude that's trying to be achieved, and I assume these two people are capable, the sentry and the patient, are capable of understanding each other. They have enough shared language and shared idiom to have this argument, and they have enough shared language to argue about what the content of being a civilian is, and at what point you become a civilian, right? Are you a civilian when you're wounded, when you're a patient, when you're so on and so on and so forth? And I think that what Böll's really great at is creating stakes out of common language, in my experience, and I think he does that really tremendously well here, despite the fact that he opens up all those questions about what common languages are being spoken and the stakes themselves are about the absence of a common language, even in common language.
I would agree. I've taught this story a few times, and I think one reason why I wanted to present it to the two of you is, I was curious about what the two of you would think of it, but, it's also one that, for such a lean story, I think, going back to, my initial thing about simplicity, I think it is a story that presents itself as very wistful and very playful, is not, like, overly careful, but that is doing things like paying very close attention to language and placing very careful emphasis on what we get to know and what we don't get to know, and what the story wants to be about. I think it's very easy, for me at least, to read this story and not worry too much about where the narrator is from. It crosses my mind, but ultimately, because of the way the story's treating that, I lean towards German, but I pay much more attention to other things. Related to that, this is kind of like a silly notion I came up with, but I think Children Are Civilians Too could be part of an anthology called On Aesthetics and Contrast, Balancing Highs and Lows. What contrast do you notice in the story? What highs, what lows? It's my imaginary anthology.
I think there are certainly highs and lows. I think a few of the things that stand out to me are some of the things that make us question realism and how real it is. And, obviously we've discussed the hole in the wall. There's the urinal. There's also the fact that the patient thinks about the snow outside as like icing on a cake. Furthermore, this little Russian girl, when she manages to put a whole basket of cakes through this hole. It's not a small hole. It's a very large hole. Also, the patient gives her 200 mark bills for all of the food, and at the end of the story is kind of just wandering back inside thinking with this huge basket of, pastries or whatever. And I think one of the things that really struck me in the encounter, outside of these strange things that happen, is the way in which a long sentence describes the girl's eyes. And this just kind of out of nowhere. From the story, quote, "Then she raised her eyes to me suddenly, at such a startling angle that her pupils slanted upward and the whites of her eyes were the thin blue of skim milk," end quote. This is maybe the only real sense of, simile or metaphor throughout the entire story. And it comes at a very weird moment on a character that may or may not be real. Right? And so, it emphasizes this in a way to, really shove me into that realm where I'm like, all right, what do I believe about this story? Because we're told multiple times that our narrator has a thick bandage around his head. And he even describes it as looking romantic at one point. So this, combined with some of the things we've mentioned already, makes me question the reality of whether any of this actually takes place at all. I think one could make an argument. It's all inside the mind of this particular narrator, because he's injured, and it's a head injury, and he's trying to recover in the hospital. I think that's one reading that could possibly be made. We could also make an argument, I think, for the events and action to have actually happened. He still has a head wound, but he's cognizant, he's out there, and maybe his perceptions are a bit different or skewed because of that head wound. All of this leading me to say, I think there's multiple readings, even more than that you can make. And I think, right, the aesthetic choices here, the highs and lows, point us to different ways you could make coherent, argumentative readings of different ways to interpret the story. And, finally, I think one of the main questions here that the story is asking is, with our children civilians, our patients, the wounded, are the wounded, were they soldiers, are they civilians now again, is what exactly does categorizing people, places, things, right, actually mean, both, to us readers outside of that time, to people in that time, right? There's a lot of different aspects of who the reader might be coming into this particular realm. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, saying this is after the war, and Adam astutely pointing out that it honestly could be during the war, is that Böll originally was going to title this particular collection 1947 to 1951. And so, in that way, I'm taking a cue from the author.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't mean that Böll actually intends it to be 1947 to 1951 either.
Yeah. Well, I think that...
This is a long rabbit hole that I went down, because I had noted that about that because of what the book jacket of this book says, but it doesn't look like there's an equivalent collection in German. So what I ended up trying to do was hunt down which stories from this collection were published, and basically I have no answers. Not sure, again. I hope some German listener helps us there.
Yeah. I think it's probably a lot to explore about general publication shifts over time.
Right.
how short stories would have gotten treated at a given moment. I think also weirdly, I think indicative of the kind of thing that this piece is, that like there's sort of what like Wikipediaing Boole and like looking about his own war experiences and his own like
Yeah.
attempts to sort of go AWOL.
Yeah.
and, like, and sort of trying not, and then like having to read the text several times and going like, okay, I'm not going to bring this ancillary knowledge in and read it through this lens, which is a tricky thing, right? Like to not, I think for the same reason as Matthew, I buy that this is shortly post-war in some way, but I don't know how far post-war, I don't know, but all of that, like within the context of the story, there's a lot of weirdness around it, and I think the whole, to your aesthetics question before I get totally the hell off track, is that I think the way this particular story works, the way it achieves a lot of its depth in seeming simplicity and definite brevity, is this, it's sort of this like Ouroboros of a story, right?
Yeah.
Like there's, I mean, even within the content, right, like about midway through the story we get this image of, and dotted about lay white islands like sugar icing, and then later on, after he's actually bought the cakes from the little girl, he says that the nice little cakes were covered with a light sugar icing of snow, where we see the kind of the desire for the cakes leads to the image of the world as being sugared with snow, and then the actualization of the cakes makes the cakes, the world, such that he sees them as covered in snow. And there's all these little moments like that in this story that have to do with, I think, perception, and that have to do with how he wants to view it, right? Like, I don't know if you remember, or if you've read like A&P by John Updike, right? Like, which, I mean, I feel like most people, at least in America, have, like, it's such a popular short story to teach.
I almost think of it as the anthologized story if you grew up at a particular time anyway.
Yeah. But I think it does the thing that, like, a lot of people want to teach about. Like, Boole's story does what a lot of people want to teach about A&P, right? Like, that teenage boy checking out girls in a supermarket starts to see them in terms of, like, the metaphors of the supermarket, right? That they have cans, for example, is a big part of that narrative. I think that this is a quieter sort of, like, engagement of that, and a much more surreal engagement of that. And I think that one thing that I'm intrigued by about it is, so you have someone and they're in a mental hospital, or they're in a hospital, or they're in a POW camp in the hospital tent or wing, or whatever they are, that there are these odd things about this person's experience that I think you can totally argue that this is a dream, or that this is a vision, or it's a surreal experience created by the surreal effect of being in war. And I mean, Ingrid, you and I were talking about this in a totally different context yesterday, like to the victim of a violence, or to the person in the hospital, I mean, there's a sincere and deep mental effect to how you contextualize your own experience, and whether you think about it as damage or honor, or like what you're doing, how what you did and why you did ends up mattering to you internally. But also, like, there's no language that changes the wound on your head, if there is a wound on your head, or like the fact that you've been shot if you've been shot, or the fact that you're dead if you're dead, and what someone calls, like, the reason that they, like, throw a bomb into your community is sort of irrelevant to you if a bomb got thrown into your community in certain aspects. And I think it, in some ways, by never asking that question but constantly asking all the questions around what we should think about this reality and how we should label this reality faces us with that question of what is the reality very directly.
I agree. I think one thing about this story that I love is it makes me think of a lot of other works that are doing similar things, but, coming at them totally differently also. So, I mean, it reminds me a great deal of one of my favorite movies of Tarkovsky's, Ivan's Childhood, and the way that it ends up engaging the horrors of war through the surreal and through images of innocence and childhood in particular. I can't help thinking about Salinger when I read Böll. And, I learned only later that he actually helped bring Salinger to Germany, helped encourage the translation of some of his books. And I mean, I think one thing that I think about a lot when I think about the highs and lows I see in the story is the ways in which he kind of toes the sentimental at times. Like, if this story were all cookies and no urinal, it might lean much more toward fairy tale, and it does lean heavily toward fairy tale, I would say, but, is doing something a little different as a result. It's always kind of towing the water, but then running backward.
Yeah.
Sometimes even in the same moment.
I think there's something funny about, I mean, I'm not, like, super well versed in that, like, era, but, like, Günter Grass is the one that, like, at least for our context, like, represents that kind of period of, like, post-war Germany to me, and I think much more about dark humor in my experience, and, like, but also when I think about it, oddly, a dude who, like, there's a lot of that writing in that time in my limited experience that's very much about things that seem really, really over the top, that kind of, that you can't, like, point to it and say, this is the moment when that goes over the top, or things that feel absurdist and funny that, like, you couldn't point to, like, this is funny because it, like, would never happen in the way that you would, like, look at that in a sitcom or something, yeah. And, like, or this is really sentimental and sad and sweet, but, like, where you couldn't say exactly, like, this is the moment where that becomes sincere. And I think there's something about that that's really telling about what those people must have gone through, including Salinger, right? Like, I think about, like, To Esme with Love and Squalor is a kind of funny story about someone who has an excessively intense relationship to someone he spent an hour with, like, and who he should probably not have spent an hour with.
The Salinger story this most reminds me of is Just After the War with the Eskimos, because it's got a similar injury, tension around war thing going on. But, I think this is a story that, like, oddly, we started out chatting about the fact that, like, there's a lot in this very short story that doesn't get answered, and, basic questions that would get answered in another story very, very clearly, and this story is one that sort of resists definitive interpretation. Like, I think it does not push us toward dream or push us toward reality, and it lives in that space where both are possible. That said, I think the details in this story are tremendous. They're what bring me back to it again and again. So in thinking about this story, I wanted to go back to James Wood's book, How Fiction Works, which does a lot of great thinking around detail. In that book, Wood thinks out what it is that makes certain details memorable. I love it that he tries to do that kind of thinking to actually, sort of do what this story is trying not to like kind of, to Matthew's point about categorization, Wood kind of wants to taxonomize a little bit, but he does it so brilliantly. So he thinks out what makes certain details memorable and others, striking for a moment maybe, but finally forgettable. And in doing that, he brings up thisness, a word that he's taken from the medieval theologian Duns Scotus, as a good place to start. By thisness, wood means, I'm quoting now, any detail that draws abstractness toward itself and seems to kill that abstraction with a puff of palpability. It's really worth reading about this in the book a little bit because he uses examples that help this land, but I thought we could talk a little bit about the details in this story, and particularly the ones that engage the senses, because that's what Wood is talking about to my mind anyway.
Yeah, I think it's a weird thing about, I think Scotus, his whole deal is he's kind of like living in that PostAquinas world where, there's like this sort of semi-scientific categorization going on, and you're trying to find the way in which there's sort of evidence of abstraction, like justice, for example, or what goodness should look like. And I think for that, I'm thinking sort of in terms of thisness, how do moments within the story or encounters within the story create some kind of palpable sense of whatever it is that this individual might be looking for. And I think because his stated goal is just to get the cakes, and that's exactly what he does, and he's capable of doing. There's also that secondary question. It's not how does what he does represent his acquisition of need in some way, but what is the need he's trying to fulfill through the action of interacting with the girl? Is it sort of liberation, or is it self-identity grasping, or is it pissing off the century and taking a little power back in that way? Is it just eating marzipan? And I think in some ways there's this kind of complex situation where it's a little of all of those things for him, and that in that way, right, I mentioned the marzipan because it is the thing for me that kind of it's the moment of wanting control or something, or wanting freedom, or to access the thing.
Adam, can you read that?
Yeah. You're gonna make me find it now, aren't you?
Yeah. Take your time. We're not going anywhere.
Yeah. So, here, I whispered, I'll take the lot. How many are there? She began counting carefully with a delicate, rather dirty little forefinger while I devoured a nut square. It was very quiet. It seemed almost as if there were a soft, gentle weaving of snowflakes in the air. She counted very slowly, made one or two mistakes, and I stood there, quite still, eating two more cakes. Then she raised her eyes to me suddenly at such a startling angle that her pupils slanted upward, and the whites of her eyes were the thin blue of skim milk. I have not found it. I thought I did.
The place with the marzipan is, quote, I took a buttermilk twist and bit into it. It was delicious. There was marzipan in it. Aha, I thought. That's why these cost as much as the others.
I thank you for locating it now that I've read something totally different. I think the thing about the marzipan that appeals to me is it's that he's having a realization. One, marzipan's a weird thing. It's an odd, very specific taste and flavor and texture. Two, it sort of actualizes and reifies the cookie that we're eating, but it's this very practical thought, right? Where it's the economics of the aha, So that the thing is there. In focusing on the marzipan, he actually has escaped temporarily, right? Later on, we're going to find that he's forgotten about the urinal stench, like not because of the marzipan, but because of the encounter. But he's in this moment, is thinking that's why this cookie, insignificant as it is to make, or easier as it is to make, is actually raised in value in some way. And I think that, for me, it's the moment he's wholly actualized the thing he's trying to do, whichever of the things I imagine he's trying to do.
I mean, I think maybe to your point of asking what it is he's trying to achieve with getting these cakes, is that I kind of read it as he wants comfort. And I mean that not just by eating food, but he wants to feel warm inside. He wants to feel like he's someone or something again, and he doesn't feel that now. And that is why he just starts gobbling these up, even though he should really savor them, because if we were to literally take this story as gospel, when's the next little girl going to come around with, a basket of fresh cakes?
Yeah.
Right. And the hole won't be filled, will still be there, not filled in, right, etc. But he says, it's been weeks, months, and all that he has, been seeing is mud, blood, a few whores, and money. All things that, aren't particularly comforting in my mind, in the way that they're framed by the war, or at least in the way that he says them, that he is tired of these things. And so at this point, it's the extremism of being in mud, of being in blood and causing blood and losing blood, and having sex with lots of people for money, and being given lots of money, and having no real thing to use the money for. And he overpays this little Russian girl 2.5 times what she asked for, and says it's no big deal because he's loaded with money and has nothing to do with it. And so I think that comfort of trying to take back some sort of personality in himself, to be his own person again, is what he wants. And at this moment, right, he's nameless. We really don't know that much about him. He's not in his homeland. He can't even speak to the Russian girl because he can't speak Russian. And so everyone in this vast land of Russia, he can't communicate with except other Germans, basically. And, people that maybe have one or two other languages that can kind of translate. One of the ways he even communicates with the girl is she writes in the snow the amount she wants for the cakes. And while they're able to exchange some base words in Russian, right, he doesn't even really understand her. And so at this point, he's looking kind of for a language of himself, who he is, what he's supposed to be doing, in order to return to some sense of personhood.
Yeah, I'm so glad I asked this question because, I think I had particular things in mind. And, I think by tying details not only to image and sense, but also to the story itself and the characters thinking about things. I think you two end up coming to some different answers. Like, when I asked this, I was thinking a little bit about the nut squares gleaming with oil. It's an image that stays with me, I think partly because I can really see the oil. And the child's eyes stay with me, the child's dirty little finger, and the fact that she writes the number 45 in the dirt or snow as a way of communicating, I think.
Also, imagine being able to read a 45 in snow that is not trampled and is
yeah, now that I'm
maybe
thinking
not
about
facing
that
him.
Yeah, no, it specifically says in the snow. I don't know. I was thinking about the dirt and mixing that one up a little bit, but you know, I mean, I think Thisness can work in all kinds of ways, and Wood, to his credit, gives a lot of different examples of the ways in which a detail can end up really landing and singing. He thinks about the fat on a baby's arms and the way it like sits and gathers as being a little like meat tied in a particular way. That's from Tolstoy. Or he thinks about in Madame Bovary, Emma Bovary, looking at like the wax on her shoes and things like that as examples of palpability. But he also does exactly what the two of you do, where he ties, you know, the character's consciousness to that detail and thinks about it that way too.
Yeah, which I think is important in this story in particular, because we're dealing with so much ineffability around the circumstances.
Indeed. So thinking about like the tradition that Böll belongs to and his style a little bit, so much of what I appreciate about Böll as an artist is his style, the way he comes at a short story, and you know, I think does it a little differently. He's been compared to Hemingway as well, and I guess I mean me as well, thinking about Salinger, but anyway. In his interview with the Paris Review, Böll notes that Hemingway was an influence, but mainly with regards to form. I wondered, you know, with regard to form, but also outside of it, how the two of you would describe Böll's style for listeners who haven't, you know, read a Böll story just yet.
Yeah, I don't know. I've read quite a bit of Böll over time, although never sort of straight through. I think earlier I'd mentioned that I think about Böll in time and place as being in conversation with Günter Grass. And I think also stylistically that there's something about that generation of Germans that sort of updates. I think they update the kind of Kafka thing, and they bring some of that kind of bureaucratic absurdism and the kind of logic of its strangeness into something that looks a little more like real life, and end up getting it sort of like, I think early John Irving looks a lot like this to me, right? Like,
oh, interesting.
That there's this sense of, I think, often beginning in a place that has its own kind of moments and fixations, and the stories tend to be held together by those kind of thematic moments and fixations, I think, repeatedly, right? Like, people are always doing something vaguely related to the war or the post-war economy, and they're sort of constantly just dealing with whatever their sort of horrifyingly hermetically sealed world is. And I think they're acting as though all of that's normal, almost like Kay in the Castle is acting like that's normal, or like Gregor Samsa has surprisingly few questions about his medical condition. Only I think here it's it's got that kind of nearly hysterical realism's quality of not quite escaping realism itself, just facing realism with I don't know, I think of it as being a little like brightly colored all the time, right? Like the lights are always dim, but everything's in sort of like stark yellows and greens and oranges in my head in a Heinrich Böll story. That's my...
I mean, this is the only Heinrich Böll story I've read, so I don't know that I'm in a position to really comment on style so much, like throughout his work.
Right.
I think
sure.
for this story, I think, maybe I would say something like, straightforward with a couple of car crashes. In that, it is it's a linear story in its way. Things happen from point A to point B. The car crashes are the things that make us question the reality. And so it's that idea of like leaving things out, and purposefully like stripping this back to a bare bones dialogue that actually has us asking more questions than understanding what the people are saying, followed by like prose that makes us wonder if we missed details in one of those car crashes, or if we can recreate the car crash in our minds to like understand how it happened. In a certain way, like we're given, pieces of the car and, maybe some reports on the bodies, and, you're the detective trying to figure out where everything belongs. And your job, though, is not really detective. Like, it doesn't really matter if you figure out where everything belongs. It's in witnessing the fact that, things have happened, and you should note why they happened and what that means to you, and consider how to proceed based on all of these things that life and what happens in life like throws at you.
That feels like such a horrifyingly accurate metaphor for the story.
Yeah, and Adam, I'm actually really glad that you brought up Kafka, in that I've been rereading The Art of the Novel by Milan Kundera, and thinking a little bit about this story, and not only things that it reminds me of, but also sort of like what it's doing in response to the tradition of stories and novels that have come before it. And I think Kafka's a useful comparison in that way. Kundera says about moving from Cervantes, where action matters and action is telling, and we go out into the world and our actions speak to who we are to some extent, and from Cervantes to Kafka, we end up getting like a sort of disbelief in action and its meaning, especially with regard to the present moment. The present, with a character like Kay, becomes meaningless. His actions seem arbitrary, and he's consumed by his present. I think this story, is one that really resists interpretation, but that somehow does something a little different with refusing interpretation. Like, it doesn't feel like the kind of bureaucratic space to me that the castle is, where nothing counts. In fact, like, the protagonist is resistant and has a particular perspective on how things should be. And, you know, I mean, I'm also glad, Adam, that you brought up Böll's personal context a little bit. I'm with you that I don't think we should read his family's resistance to the Nazi Party and his own as the way to read this story, but I think it's certainly like an interesting thing to think about alongside this story. And, you know, I mean, I think for me, this story seems to actually be trying to look for meaning, push toward it, look for comfort, and it wants that action back. The ending in particular points me to that, the kind of response we get from the narrator there. But, you know, before we go to the ending of the story, I wanted to ask just a simple question of the two of you. I think while preference for stories is a little arbitrary, I think sometimes like why we like a story and what draws it to us, or, you know, we find like repulsive about it, can be really useful. So do you like this story, and if so, why?
Hell yeah, I do. I like this story a lot. I think it's, I think it's like a lot of stories we've been reading lately, both for StoryTalk and outside StoryTalk, maybe existentially upsetting, and like I think has a lot of depth in its way of approaching certain questions. It sends me on an existential chain of like thinking out those questions. That I'm glad it's not wintertime when we're reading. But I think the style and the precision of the choices and the sort of seeming ease with which that story gets presented, right, like is so remarkable, even though I spend a lot of time, you know, like you two know this about me, I go to like a state park a lot, and like, you know, I'll go to the urinal there and it smells like an open pit urinal, and I think about this story, and that's the part that ends up sticking with me, is like not the marzipan and the beautiful moment of the marzipan, but that the marzipan is somehow this delusion where a man is standing over an open pit toilet and eating greedily and desperately, even if you take this story to be real. And there's a real sad version of it where it is sort of delusion or dream, and the delusion or dream still includes things over an open pit toilet.
Oh no.
And I think that like there's a part of me that like just wants to like hug my teddy bear and go to sleep after it, which doesn't stop me from perpetually reading Böll at all. So that's my
My answer is also yes. Not for that reason. But,
oh my gosh.
my answer is yes because, in my mind, it rewrites the Russian novel.
oh, weird.
Right? So, by that I mean, if you're thinking about, like, you know, any of the famous Russian novels, most of them, maybe not most of them, it seems like a lot of them are really fucking long. Okay? And the reason they're so long is that we're so far into the interiority of a character that we stay there for a really long time, where it's just the character thinking about things.
Yeah.
And like one thing has happened and we get like 30 pages of them thinking about the action, right? And then finally something else happens and they run into another character. Like that's the Russian novel.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they're not good. They are good. However, this rewrites the Russian novel in effect because we get that at the end of this story, inside the character's head, and we don't have to read another 30 to 500 pages to like understand where they're at.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I asked that because both of your answers are deeply amusing. And, I think Matthew is so true that one thing that's so impressive about this story is how much it manages to do in a short space and what it's chosen to leave out. I want to end by just reading the ending because I think it's powerful. It speaks for itself, though, so I'm going to shut up and just read. For the first time, I noticed the revolting urinal stench from the corner, and all the nice little cakes were covered with a light sugar icing of snow. With a sigh, I picked up the basket and walked toward the building. I did not feel cold. I had that romantic-looking bandage round my head and could have stood for another hour in the snow. I left because I had to go someplace. A fellow has to go someplace, doesn't he? You can't stand around and let yourself be buried in snow. You have to go someplace, even when you're wounded in a strange, black, very dark country. And then there's an ellipses. I think it does, in its same whimsical but thoughtful way, I think end up engaging like this question of action and really ending in this place where he's walking, but where is he going and what does his movement mean at this point? I guess for us to decide. I think it's a bleak but, very stirring ending, finally. So, shall we end there?
Heck yes.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.